Alrighty. Well, greetings, everybody. I'm Rob Smith, Associate Professor in History over at Marquette and Director our Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach. My buddy Adam Carr. Adam, you want to say hello?
I'm Adam Carr, and I'm had the honor of collaborating with Rob and the rest of our team on the March on Milwaukee project, this is sort of the end of our month-long series.
Yep, this was the first month of what will be many to come. And in this conversation, we are indeed not in the webinar mode. We are in a group meeting to talk about the difficulties, the challenges, and then the successes also with teaching race and equality, very difficult topics in the classroom. And we've got a bit of a PowerPoint for us to help us stay on track a little bit. We're going to be obviously using this recording for instructing and other purposes. And so we do have a bit of an organization to this. We're going to talk a little bit about some ground rules first, and then we'll get into three bigger categories, the classroom and teaching methods in the classroom. And then we'll talk a little bit about the broader question of knowledge and teaching history and what that all means. And then get into some other personal viewpoints and approaches and questions. And then we have a few announcements to let you folks know what's on deck for us for the remaining months to come. Over the next several months, we've got some ideas already in mind and getting ironed out. So, you know, this evening, we're having a bit of a conversation. This is free flowing. We're going to be using our chat feature. Folks are more than welcome to jump in and out of the conversation as needed and participate as much or as little as you like to. But more than anything else, we wanted to provide the opportunity for us to have a conversation about how to grapple with some of these very difficult conversations in the classroom. And it's especially important for us to acknowledge how difficult this particular moment is around a whole number of issues that will inform how we teach this particular moment in history. And if we've learned anything over the last several years, and certainly over the last several months, getting this particular moment, getting history correct is very, very important. And making sure that the narratives and stories that then begin to make up that history, to make up that tapestry, is indeed done effectively and as accurately as possible. Any other thoughts, Adam?
No, I think let's jump into it. I do want to make sure, as maybe was apparent from the fact I didn't even know how to enter presentation mode, I did not make this beautiful PowerPoint, someone else did. So I don't want to take any credit where it is not due. And with that, let's just move to our ground rules.
Cool. We know the Zoom, we know the Zoom and digital meeting hustle now. We are all, as I like to say, Zoom knowledgeable. We are Zoom savvy. Please keep your mics muted when you're not talking, just to avoid background noises. I got trees and squirrels around me. I got a squirrel, folks. This is a funny story. Every time I'm out here on the porch doing some work, I got a squirrel that just comes up on the porch and stares at me as if I'm not supposed to be here. And so I need to have a conversation with that squirrel at some point.
Rob, can anyone else see the squirrel?
I barely can see the squirrel. Sometimes he kind of shows up and disappears, but if he comes
I was saying
out,
he might be in your mind.
That's possible. It could be me. It could be me making this up. So we'll follow our Zoom protocols and Zoom etiquette. We also are going to record this. Want to make sure folks know that, just so that we can make it available later. And then we come from various backgrounds. We come from various levels of education. And we want to make sure that all of those experiences are valued and welcomed as we share widely our experiences and our challenges and our thoughts. And so with that in mind, if there
ready?
Are ground rules, let's get started. Let's talk, folks. All the images that you see come from the March on Milwaukee collection that we've used throughout this month to talk about the open housing marches. And so we want to continue to privilege those very wonderful images because they capture the open housing marches in so many interesting ways. And our young people in particular get really engaged in the images. And we know the power of images, particularly in the classroom. Adam, why don't you talk us through these icebreaker ideas? I think this was your idea.
You know, yeah, when we were constructing this event, we didn't know if we would have 5 people or 50, and we have 18. And I was thinking we could do this in the chat. We do have one person on the phone as well. I don't know if that person has the app on their phone so they can see the visuals. But I was thinking, let's do this in the chat because I think that might be the most efficient for time because we have a bunch of great questions. Would everyone just answer? We'll do one at a time. So first, your name and affiliation. Then we'll do what motivated you to attend, and then what you're hoping to gain. That'll help us kind of nose in the room and then calibrate to what everybody's hoping to get out of it. So why don't we just start? Folks, can you just start putting in the chat who you are, your affiliation? I assume most of the folks in this room are educators, so where you might be an educator. So Kristen Leffelman from the Wisconsin Historical Society is here. Heather Godley from Case High School, who's also an integral part of the March on Milwaukee Education Committee. We've got Janice from, it's William from Marquette.
We got William.
Actually, we have both of them. We have both of them, yes.
Absolutely.
We have Matt, an educator in the school district of Waukesha. Louise from Marquette.
Nate Rice out of West Dallas Central.
Lisa Marquette, yeah, and soon to be UWGB. Brienne from Sun Prairie Schools, instructional coach. This is a nice. We also have the other Godly here from Alverno. We have Matt, Abby from Marquette, John, 9 years MPS teacher, 20 years educator, taught Marquette during the Gates redesign in 2002. All right, this is a great room of people. And as Rob identified, there's a pretty healthy range of where people are coming from. Tanya.
Hey, Tanya. Tanya's back. Good to see you again, Tanya.
Yeah.
I want to. From Cedarburg. Welcome, Julie from Cedarburg. There's Amanda. What's up, Amanda? Janice is our Dean of Libraries. It's great to have some librarians and archivists and all these folks in this conversation as well. Those folks get the documents for us.
Yeah, and just a point Tanya made, I went through a good portion of today just feeling despondent. So I think some folks, Rob, you mentioned the importance of the last few years, the last few months, but even the last few hours, there's been stories emanating around us, and I don't know, it's difficult to sit in this city or even this country. So, all right. So folks are already getting the second question. Great. What motivated you to attend this table talk? So why don't folks in a phrase, in a sentence, share why you decided to, of all the different exciting Zoom conversations with other nerds you could go to this evening
on a Friday at 8 o'clock.
On a Friday at 8 when you could be at the club, Sam's Club, bulk shopping. What brings you here to this Zoom? Yeah. All right, seeking inspiration.
See if we can inspire some folks tonight. History is fun, Heather. Absolutely right. History is a lot of fun. It's as difficult and as trying as it can be. Absolutely.
Every time you say history is fun, I cringe.
You don't believe me.
That's the difference between you and me, Adam. I love it. Love hearing him say it every time he does.
And Heather,
I've come to love it.
With the audio, folks, if you
good.
feel the urge to jump in and verbalize some things, feel free to do that too. We are free flowing. We are comfortable. I'm sure we all have our beverage of choice, non-alcoholic or otherwise.
John mentioned March in the 50th anniversary of the Housing March is taught on the north side and continues to teach in the inner city in Jersey City now.
Jersey City.
So Amanda Sepinen, who I've known since we were in high school, seeking practical, actionable steps, the only way to feel more helpful. That sounds like Amanda. Absolutely.
Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Coalition in our district, Matt. Yeah, that all of that, we certainly understand the challenges associated not only with the classroom, but the way these kinds of conversations more broadly are important for institutions and cultural shifts and cultural change and all of that. Like these are some of the building blocks to get not only our students more knowledgeable, but also our colleagues, staff, and faculty to make sure that they are also continuing to learn and think critically about issues of race and equity.
So Kristen's
East
actually
Coast
back.
represent. That's right. When the East is in the house.
Kristen
Absolutely.
Kristen Leffelman pointed out teaching local history makes it more relevant for students, and that's exactly why I still have that aversion to the idea of history being fun, because it so rarely is about the world around you.
And we need some Hootie references, Adam.
I know that's a deep cut. That proves that you've been around for these.
Hootie reference. Absolutely.
Serious wrecker.
Well, what we're going to do is really have a conversation about how we all go about these topics and share with one another our own successes and our challenges, and get into a conversation about how we can continually improve on these practices. And so we definitely are looking forward to not only supporting one another, but then also thinking about ways to support our students. And let's be really honest. In these times, we need the choir. We oftentimes say we preach to the choir, and we say that as a bit of a knock. But sometimes we need the choir, and more than ever, the choir is important.
And actually, I mean, that last question, I feel like folks clearly probably says something about the kind of people who are here today. I think folks answered the third question a little bit in the second. If you have any other thoughts about what you're hoping to gain from this discussion today, this isn't so big a group of people that we can't calibrate what we're talking about to what you'd like. So if anybody has any last thoughts about what you're hoping to gain from this conversation, it can be abstract, it can be concrete. We've already seen a mix of that from folks. Pop that in the chat right now, and then we will officially begin.
And Matt, I want to make sure to get back to Matt real quickly. We do have some folks in the call who work in that very world of diversity, inclusion, and equity for institutions. And so we'll get into some of those topics, certainly.
Appreciate it.
Cool, let's go. All righty, let's start with the good stuff. Let's begin on a high note, and hopefully we can end on a high note as well. What's been successful in the classroom? What works for you? How do you effectively engage students around these topics? And then we'll save the third one for more of a broader conversation about who our students are and how we work with the identities that they bring to the classroom. Hey, Louise, there's Louise Kanker. Welcome, Louise. Another colleague of ours at Marquette University, teaches this stuff as well, does some great work with engaged learning. Welcome, Louise.
So John, we'll kick it off. John, you can unmute yourself if you'd like to. He mentioned he loved the ideas from Dasha Kelly in the last session, and some of the conversation lesson with primary documents have been great, looking for more pragmatic ideas like that. So just to fill folks in, what we ended up doing, this is an idea extending from a year-long project that we did in the year subsequent to the 50th anniversary. And Dasha and I were just kind of kicking around ideas of how do we make young people excited about history, and we knew the images were really powerful, and we could feel the emotion that people expressed upon seeing them. So we basically just made a meme making activity. When we do it the full way, we print out photos, we put them in front of students, then we get transparency sheets, and then they're able to write right on top of the photos. I actually like I have a big bag of silver Sharpies, so they can write against the black and white, and it kind of pops out a little bit. That I find the tactility of it, of them getting their hands on it. Rob and I just did this in Milwaukee. Actually, the very last hour of the very last day that MPS was in session, we were at Milwaukee High School, the arts, and the art students who were kind of quiet about a lot of the other pieces, when we put the images in front of them and they started to get their hands on them and work with them and look at them, man, it was like a dream come true to see those high school students just like who are art students just like engaging with history and responding to it in a really interesting way.
And I think to that point, if we answer the question, or if I answer the question, what's been successful in my experience, engaging the arts is very important. I can't emphasize that enough, whether that's in the classroom or class experiences that are outside of the classroom as well. One particular event that we were a part of at Marquette included taking our students to see the play The Niceties over at the Repertory Theater here in Milwaukee. And, engaging the arts is very powerful because the arts can do things that the academic or the educator maybe struggles with a little bit. The arts can tug at emotions. The arts can give us a window into feelings. The arts can elicit a whole set of responses that even the most difficult of classroom topics sometimes are challenged to do. And so if there's one particular broader tip, idea, strategy, method that I would encourage is engaging the arts as much as possible. Everything from poetry, music is very valuable. You can't there for these types of issues, you can call on the work of Stevie Wonder and uh, Curtis Mayfield and Beyonce. You can call on musicians of a wide variety to help complement and supplement what we do in the classroom. A lot of what we often do, understandably, is we put the onus on ourselves as educators to carry the weight of the conversation, and the arts helps to take a little bit of that pressure off and let the artist speak and let the artist tell some of these stories and engage some of these questions. The other successful strategy, as we all know, is using primary documents, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail. The documents oftentimes allow for the issue to be discussed through the document, so that we, as the educator, are not solely responsible for carrying that weight and carrying that burden. The documents are, as Adam mentioned, artifacts that we can go to that help to tell the story, to help to tell the narrations, complement the narration that we're doing in class. So the arts are very valuable. Let's never forget the importance of those.
So Keisha made a really good point. Feel free to interrupt Rob or me. You'll notice that we feel free to interrupt each other, or also you can drop stuff in the chat as well. Anybody have an idea where you can respond to any of these questions that are out here right now? Methods that you found successful in your experience, how you engage students into difficult topics, and even some thoughts about who your students are and how their identity, what they're bringing into their classroom.
Yeah, I'd like to hear some voices. Anybody who wants to chime in and talk a little bit, please do.
I can speak from a middle school educator experience.
Please do, Matt. Absolutely.
Love it.
Sure. So I kind of have the benefit of having a shop as an engineering instructor. And so I try to stage my projects around more open-ended results. Instead of saying we're all going to build this, we're going to build or make something that uses tools A, B, and C, or 1, 2, 3. And the projects that kids make get so personal oftentimes, which, whether it be formally or informally, leads to further conversations, I've noticed, since I switched to that format. And kids talk to each other like, oh, I made you design that, or I made you come up with that. Whether it be 3D printing or laser printing, or CNC milling, any of the T-shirt stuff that we do. I try to keep it that kids can be creative and kind of express themselves through their artwork or their projects. That art piece you mentioned really made me think of that. I've had other people come and visit and actually kind of study how I do that. And I've had a lot of success with it and kind of letting kids express who they are through their projects.
If only people would teach civics that way. What's the 3D printer for civics? Sorry.
Don't know. I mean, well, you know what? I did. I mean, I'll incorporate other cross content pieces into it. So like we did a laser project one time where they had to do some cartography and make a map, and each layer of cardboard represented an elevation. And so they had to pick a country of interest to them, and they had to do some research on the country itself. And I did not let them pick the United States. They had to pick somewhere else. But it led to some really deep conversations, to be honest with you.
The other really successful experience that I'm really always thrilled to engage, and I think students at all levels appreciate this, is the guest speaker. And in many respects, the guest speakers that I rely on heavily are local experts, community activists, community voices, folks who are oftentimes seemingly disconnected from the classroom, but whose experiences, they bring their own particular kind of intellectualism to the classroom. The folks who are in many respects at the grassroots level, right on the ground, grappling with issues in real time. These folks are so valuable to the classroom, and many of them really want to be in the classroom. And I know that there are challenges that institutions might raise to getting some folks into the classroom. I'm sure there's a whole set of protocols that go into that, but relying on local expertise, particularly when teaching local history or using local history as a window into broader historical topics, we just can't ever go wrong when we bring in folks who are really in the middle of some of these basic fights around equality.
Even sometimes I found when doing, because I do some work I do tours and work with school staff sometimes. A lot of times there's even really incredible people just in the building. I found if you start a conversation that's typically not had among a staff or faculty, you might find that someone, might find a paraprofessional. This has happened several times for me. Someone who's just someone from the neighborhood will come in and say, oh, I know that. Or even, I'll say this, bus drivers. I've done tours before.
Yeah.
Bus drivers, I'll tag them in. And a bus driver will know a ton. On open housing marches tour, I talked to a guy who was he's like, oh my God, it's like you're walking me back through my childhood. So so experts, and I always like to point to the expertise you can find within just kind of what's become common to you. There can be some really extraordinary things in there. John made a great point here about 3D printing for civics is in branding, 3D pumpkins at Halloween for the Democratic primary candidates, 3D party representations. That's a very
John, you just
creative.
gonna lob that pumpkin, that orange pumpkin up there for us like that. Come on, man.
Yeah, that's great.
Just gonna lob that up there for us. Let's get into this third question, and then we'll move to our next section. Who are your students? And let's be also very direct about this. We're working with overwhelmingly students who are in the city of Milwaukee. Many of them are African American and Latino, as well as from other populations. We work with white students as well, but we know we have some folks on the call who are from districts that are overwhelmingly made up of white students and white families. If you want to share some of your thoughts and some of your challenges, please do, because we know that it's in those environments where we sometimes need the most support. And as we think about that, let's talk a little bit about who our students are and how their identity impacts the classroom. But some of you folks from some of these districts where there are not as many diverse folks there, if you want to share some ideas, we really appreciate it. And I'm sure there are other folks on the call who will as well. Thanks, Ms. Pitts. That's very important. K-5 suburban students who are transitioning from Chicago, Madison, Milwaukee. Yeah, 94% white. It's a challenge, absolutely.
So at Marquette, and the institution I'm transitioning to is a predominantly white institution. And whenever I, as a woman of color, talk about racialized topics, I get accused of being biased, but then there's also white defensiveness that I am calling them personally bad. And that tends to be the thing that I have not quite figured out how to address.
Other folks experience those kinds of challenges in the classroom? Because it's not only the identity of the students that are at work, but it's also the assumed identity of the educator as well. Absolutely, Nate. Nate, that's an interesting mix over in West Allis, though. I don't think folks would have guessed that West Allis was that diverse.
Sure. It's changed, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to be in that environment. And I think to the last point about talking about race, culture, identity is something that I think is not necessarily supported at times. Students, a lot of our staff say, I don't see color, but yet all the kids do. And yes, you do too. And if you don't capitalize on that and talk about that and what's the word, represent that to your students, you're missing a huge way to connect with them. When you bring up race as a topic, ethnicity, culture, all that stuff, the kids, like a lot of those kids will just light up and they're going to be totally engaged. They're going to see you coming from a genuine place of courage where you're willing to discuss stuff like that instead of just pretending it's not there and just doing what you know how to do best, which is teach the culture and teach the way that you maybe were taught as a kid and have no understanding of how other students may be learning that are different from you. It's kind of like, come along with me because I know the right way. Be more like me and you'll be more successful. And you're going to have a lot of kids putting up their hands and say, I'm not going with you with that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, John, we appreciate you sharing that about your sister having that challenge, canvassing for Hillary Clinton in West Dallas, which, it's a very interesting set of cultural collisions happening in surrounding suburban districts where they're becoming more diverse. Classrooms are becoming more diverse. The staff and faculty may not be as diverse, and so you have both the institutional challenges and then also the classroom challenges, which are made all the more complicated by the challenges outside of the classroom and outside of the school.
I want to make sure we don't miss a comment that Louise made before. Teaching white supremacy this week, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Case for Reparations, Edward Bonilla Silva, Racism Without Racist, Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, and asking students to put these in conversation with each other. Louise, I have a question for you. Do you excerpt those? Because those are all pretty hefty uphill climbs for a lot of students.
Yeah. College or otherwise.
Yeah. Do you take sections that you selected for them to make the reading burden a little less?
You want to jump in and talk with us, Louise? We'd love to hear from you.
Or you can chat. Maybe she thought we ignored her, so she was like,
oh,
there we go.
The whole Atlantic article in the Michelle video. The Atlantic as an intellectual space is very valuable because they do oftentimes provide videos to supplement the articles that the experts are writing. And it's oftentimes very useful to let the videos of the writers and the journalists and the scholars also be in conversation with the written text. And we do have to, as we all know, rely on multimedia or multiple media or a wide body of media to get into some of these conversations and to make them work. To that point, I want to encourage graphic novels. There was a moment where graphic novels were really starting to kind of creep into the classroom. And I feel like over the last couple of years, we sort of backed away. But, there's some great graphic novels out there. And Adam and I have been threatening to do some graphic novels of the open housing marches, and we should be held accountable and do that. But let's not forget about what might seem to be simple or simpler texts, simpler education materials that we can use in the classroom, because for so many of the students in our classes, and in some cases for us as instructors, a lot of us are being exposed to this for the first time, and they're already complicated enough. And so simplifying or simpler teaching materials are very useful. Absolutely, Janice. March is excellent. Multiple volumes. An American
novel seems to have ignited the conversation a little bit.
Yeah.
Before we move on,
Tanya said we better do it now.
Before we move to the next section, there was something that one of my colleagues did at Marquette, and I thought it was a really interesting exercise for students that could be adapted from elementary throughout college. But they were assigned for a history class, they were assigned to make a self-exhibit, as if they were designing a museum exhibit that explained who they were. And they couldn't use like a picture of themselves, they had to use objects. And so they had to have a certain number of objects and write out, the explanation, this represents this, and as if they were actually doing a real exhibit. And it was really interesting because some of the ones that I saw, when you read it, you realize you almost can't get a picture of who that person is in your mind, because what when you look at them, what you think their background would be or what their experience would be doesn't match what they feel it is or what they're displaying about themselves. And so that could be a really unique tool and a really great activity to have students do, because then it gets deeper below the surface with not only how they see themselves, but then they start to see their classmates and they're like, wow, I really connect with them on this, or hey, we kind of have the same thing here. Whereas before, if they just look at each other, they're like, I don't know if I can connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Brianne mentioned the Zen education historians Zooms that are happening. Those are pretty amazing. I've listened in on a couple of those. Those are really, really good. And I also want to get to William's point about kindred, which gets us into, I think, another avenue, which is science fiction, and what we have been referring to as Afrofuturism. You know, all of that creative and that creativity that comes into exploring issues of race are very valuable. Again, it kind of takes the pressure off. It allows for the conversations to be had in creative ways that allow you to get into some topics that then don't put the onus purely on the instructor and the educator. And I want to make sure that we get back to Lisa's point. You know, what Lisa really is mentioning, there's the challenges as a woman of color. You know, as a Black male, when I walk into a classroom, I come with, in an odd kind of way, I come in with quite a bit of authority that I hadn't actually earned. You know, I get it because of my race and my gender, and I don't experience the same kind of pushback that I know a lot of women who teach these topics experience. And so that requires not only for the departments and the leaders of our departments and our academic institutions to be supportive, it also requires the entire institution to be held accountable for making sure that we support folks who are meeting resistance in the classroom because they are women or because they are from different backgrounds or what have you. And so we have to make sure that we are also demanding that our institutions and our departments own up to supporting us in these very difficult and challenging conversations with our classes.
I just want to, before we move to the next slide, just a little background on this image that a lot of folks probably can't tell. The commandos are looking at some campaign materials from George Wallace, when he visited Milwaukee. And when George Wallace visited Milwaukee, he was greeted by Southsiders singing him Dixie in Polish. And he is on the record saying that if he could live anywhere outside of the South, it would be the South side of Milwaukee. 50 years ago, of course. But that is just something to, when we have conversations about Milwaukee today, that population has largely moved into the suburbs south and west of the South side. But something to keep in mind.
Oh, let's get into this next one. You know, let me preface this a little bit, because while these topics are challenging, we do have one particular tool that is in our tool belt, which is somehow or another, students come into our classrooms knowing just a little bit about the civil rights movement. They don't always know the details. They don't always know, for example, how important Bayard Rustin or how important Ella Baker was, but they certainly have some sort of historical consciousness about the importance of the 1950s and 60s. Maybe it's because of what we do every February, but we do at least have the notion that students come to classes knowing something about civil rights movement, protests, and all that. And as much as we sometimes have to deal with the same stories and same narratives with that, it does provide an inroad. But let's get into some more questions that get us thinking about identity and thinking about some broader concepts. How does the way that we identify with the past shape our perspective? You know, how do we as educators impact our own instruction? You know, what are we bringing to the classroom that's valuable, that's useful, that's important? And how do we then work to fold that into the classroom? You know, we oftentimes are told that we want to be unbiased, but we know that that is almost impossible. None of us are fully non-biased. Cicero, yes, it's really important that we not run away from the vicious racism of the North. You know, when we teach these historical topics, we are quick to blame the South. And our Northern histories tell us that at the very least with the Great Migration, along with large numbers, millions of Black people moving north, racism came north as well and was certainly there all along. Other thoughts? How do we, when
Can
we, go ahead, Adam, yeah.
Oh, that wasn't me.
Oh,
that was William.
go ahead, William.
I just had two comments. One, it's really getting dark at your place, Rob. It's like all of a sudden you're in the dark.
It's not so bad. I got a street light or two out here, so I'm okay. I turn the porch light on.
But the other is, you know, when you talk about this with history, one of the things that, and I mentioned kindred earlier, it's really interesting that we keep revisiting that idea. I think of Octavia Butler's Kindred. There was some time ago on PBS, back when my kids were small, there was a young adult version of Kindred where a guy from the streets of some city unnamed suddenly found himself back on a plantation. And that was aimed at young people. And then, of course, Haile Germina, the Ethiopian filmmaker, did Sankofa, which did follow that theme. And then, of course, now you've got a film with Janelle Monáe in it following that same theme.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting that they are working on that past and present by thrusting somebody from today's society back into the days of slavery. And they're trying to sort out the differences and perhaps even similarities, how things have changed in that. But that it's interesting to me that in the world of literature and filmmaking, that this particular historical theme keeps being revisited. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that or not.
And I'm responding to you, John. I'll just mention it. That's a really important point, William, on in a couple of ways. One, we have now with Netflix and Hulu and these other what were sort of rogue digital platforms not long ago. They've become mainstream, and while becoming mainstream, I think these other platforms have done a great job of staying true to being somewhat rogue in their approach. And so there are a number of really, really good videos on both Netflix and Hulu and other places that get into some really important historical, what we might call historical fiction, along with the science fiction, Afrofuturism. One other that I'd recommend is Mudbound on Netflix, which traverses the experiences of a Black veteran who goes back to the South. And one important thread to civil rights activism, rights-based activism, has been the role of servicemen, Black servicemen in particular, in those experiences. And you know, they come back home and they want democracy at home after having fought for democracy abroad. They are important in local movements. They are important in a whole range of ways. And so, you know, teaching about the experiences of folks who have given their lives for the country helps to get us into some of these topics as well. You know, it's hard to argue against someone who has fought for these very basic rights overseas and elsewhere, to suggest that they then come back to Jim Crow. You know, that is a really, really important way to talk about not only servicemen, but these fundamental notions around who is a citizen and citizenship more broadly. You know, John, you mentioned this. We do talk a lot about not overly privileging Father Grappi in the narrative of the open housing marches, but that's also encouraging us not to fall victim to great person, great man theorization in the classroom and around these topics. And so as much as we uh, do raise the somewhat provocative notion of not canonizing Father Grappi, no pun intended, along in that process. Part of why we're doing so is to talk about the importance of all of the nameless other people who were so central to the successes of those campaigns. And so we don't want to diminish Father Grappi's role. We just want to make sure that other voices in those experiences are there for. Exactly, Luis. What the hell were they fighting for? Absolutely.
Yeah, John, I Grappi tends to be this lightning rod, and to just stay in that metaphor, when in fact the energy that created the open housing marches, as is the case with so many other movements, was distributed amongst a large group of people, and the vast majority of them being young African American people. And I think, so to me, the project of de-emphasizing Grappi, like Rob said, it isn't about unseating him, but it's about locating the power of the story where it actually happened, which I think in a lot of ways, I don't think I think the open housing marches are probably an acute version of this. I'm sure there's a lot of ways in which kind of the decentralized nature of a movement's obfuscated by the tendency just to say that guy did it. But man, I think Grappi's role in it, and the way that he has eclipsed so much of the narrative, has really hurt that story from being owned by generations of young Black people. So that's a difficult thing it is a balancing act.
You know, Vietnam is critical. I appreciate that comment, Janice, about the Vietnam era and what changes as a result of Vietnam. Vietnam also allows us to continually question how folks engage in wartime efforts, and then how that resonates domestically. You know, you can have a number of rights-based conversations around Vietnam, whether it's its connection to the civil rights movement as a later phase, but then also it really gets us into the way student protests play a role in that late 60s, early 70s moment as well. And for young people in particular, and why we like to focus on young people, it's so important for them to see themselves in the narrative. You know, for young people to see themselves as agents of social change. And I know that for, in some cases, empowering young people can also be threatening, you know,
Yeah.
because they might turn around 2 days later and hold a nonviolent protest in your class, you know. But, you know, we need them to find their voices, especially these days.
And yeah, I mean, you can point that out in a lot of history too, right? Like, I mean, the open housing marches being the place where we focused, and we said this in our last talk, the NAACP was not wild about the youth council. They were kind of, they thought of the youth council as, I mean, I don't even talk about this much because it's difficult to articulate in a way that doesn't, I don't know. So Artie Halyard, who's one of on the Mount Rushmore of people contributing to the Black community of Milwaukee in the early days, she formed the youth council, and she thought of it as sort of the way to train professionals. So when they started moving into the streets and activism, it ruffled feathers. And I think, yeah, and not that every story doesn't need to have she doesn't become the antagonist by virtue of the fact that she had critique of them. And I think that's what's hard, and why I don't talk about it. But that tension between generations doesn't mean that one's totally right and one's totally wrong.
Yeah. And as we think about particularly engaging these topics with predominantly white classrooms and predominantly white educational institutions, I think it would be remiss of us if we did not one more time mention the Wisconsin Historical Society's vast collection on Freedom Summer. And Freedom Summer is still this very important moment in not only the civil rights movement, but in activism more broadly, because of the ways that Black and white student activists come together. They fracture soon after. But there is this sort of rich moment where you have Black and white students who are in the belly of America's race war, and white students and white activists are killed during the 1960s. White students are very valuable in not only highlighting the grotesque nature of American racism in the South, but also the important contribution that whites have made to this broader landscape of equality.
I'm hearing from Command Central. Moving to the
Command
next
Central.
slide.
All right. Okay. Is it unfair to judge people and actions in the past by today's standards, by the standards of today? Let's just ask the question. Was Thomas Jefferson a racist?
Here's a harder question. Can I still watch Dave Chappelle specials?
Absolutely. How do we deal with this? How do you all think, what are your thoughts about this particular question? How do we judge historical actors given what we know today? Anybody have thoughts about that? This is probably less of a direct instructional question and much more of a thematic conversation that we have with ourselves as educators.
So
yeah, go ahead.
I don't actually let my students use the word racist.
Okay.
One of the things that I have found is that when a student calls something racist, I have seen it meant that they did not have to engage with what I was asking them to engage with. So they could not say, oh, that's racist, it is bad, so therefore I don't have to talk about this. So I don't let them say that because, okay, it's racist. Why are we looking at it then? Why am I asking you to do this? And I've had mixed results. I've had students walk out of a classroom. I've had other students say that I'm making things unnecessarily hard, but then I've also had students who sort of came to it from a place where I didn't know that this was bad, or this was something that reinforced institutionalized problems. So it's difficult because they want to, it's kind of in my head, it's the same thing as saying all Nazis are evil, so I don't have to think about why they were evil. And it's a mixed bag. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it also means that I'm pushing them beyond where they're comfortable, and a lot of people don't like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's a good
Like
strategy. Yeah, and I'm not as adept with it as you are, Lisa. One of the places that I find myself is demanding that students not use words like we and they. Not really sure who the we is, not really sure who the they was, all that kind of stuff. And I've had the luxury of teaching issues of race to a predominantly Black class, a relatively mixed class, and then a predominantly white class. And those are all very different experiences. And I don't know that I can say that one is better than the other. I think if I had to choose, I'd prefer a more diverse class because you get more diverse opinions. I found that on either end, the predominantly Black class can be dominated by a few voices, and a predominantly white class can be dominated by a few voices. I found that the mixed classroom provides the most interesting landscape to explore some of these topics. And of course, we don't always get the luxury of having that experience, and I've only had that experience a very few times, but it has been, for me, it made for a richer classroom experience because folks can't get into the we's and the they's. Folks can't get into their camps as easily. And it also provides a little more room for students who might have dissenting opinions from their peers to find some colleagues or build some coalitions with folks who think a little bit more like them somewhere in the middle of some of those topics.
One thing that I picked up from a professor at Marquette when, like Lisa said, how do we engage the students and, to talk about these topics in a certain way. And one professor said, you know, think of the why, had the students think of the why, not just this event happened with this group of people. Okay, but let's go beyond that. How did it get to that point? Why did it get to that point? And to understand the why, we have to understand, you know, what influences are they having? What is their mindset? What is their mentality? And when we start putting all those pieces together, not saying it makes any sort of justification for it, but understanding how one gets to that point can be really great in having an understanding of the overall conversation, because then it's not just, I think you're wrong and that's that. It's, okay, you have these influences. Now I understand how I can better have a conversation with you. And another way a different professor did with her class, and I haven't had the chance to do it with any students yet, but I do think it is a really great exercise, is we have to understand that when we look back at the past and we're looking back at history and we're explaining it from the viewpoint of, we essentially know what happened, so to speak. When history is in the moment, take for instance right now coronavirus or the protests that are going on nationwide, you know, a couple big issues. What's going to happen in the next month? We don't know, because that hasn't become history yet. That's still our future. And at one point in time, when all these events are going on, it's not history, it's the present. It's still the future for them. And so what she did to illustrate that is she took newspapers. And so each week in their class, they had a newspaper from that week. They couldn't go any further. They just had that week. And they had to respond to, okay, what's going on? This is the information they have available to them at that time. I mean, this is from like the 1850s or something like that. And so she said, okay, put yourself in their shoes. This is the only information you have available to you at that time. How do you make sense of the world around you? And I think when we take ourselves out of now, transport ourselves back and understand their world the way they're looking at it, we can start to see how, okay, maybe this is what they were thinking, or this is what they were engaging with. And I think it really helps to put it into perspective from their point of view versus our point of view.
And you know, Brian, that's a really good point. And Brian, you sort of earmarked that very effectively. We do have to teach students to question both. Absolutely, to Keisha's point. We absolutely do have to teach them to question both. And that gets us to, or gets us back to, the importance of the document. You know, debate the document. The document is the place of debate, which helps to sidestep some of the subjectivity. We can't emphasize enough the importance of the document, the text of the document. I like to use law and policy. You know, if you want to talk about slavery, use the slave codes. The slave codes tell us all we need to know about the institution. It teaches us about how heinous the institution was. It teaches us how people resisted the institution. It teaches about the economics of the institution. You know, those documents are going to always be valuable. And I'll also say that for those of us who have the ability to do so, engage archivists and librarians in our classroom development, in our course development, so that we're using not only materials that we find valuable, but the archivists and the librarians, they are sitting on troves of information, and I found that they have amplified my classroom experience to places that I couldn't take them had I not been in touch with them. And I do mean to suggest to engage them with course development. Long before you get in the classroom, sit down with some folks who have access to a wide array of documents to help think through how to carefully place materials into the classroom schedule as best as possible.
I mean, maybe I'm saying the same thing I said before when you suggested the importance of bringing local experts into the room, and I'm kind of also synthesizing how Kristen was responding to Lisa. Is that I say this, that the bookshelf of Milwaukee is missing most of the books. because in the avenues of how that kind of literature gets created, a huge swath of what the real narrative of the place is never had access to those levers of power. And therefore, oftentimes, I'm not saying they're totally devoid of them, but the archives will be missing sometimes, that they won't have total fidelity to all that happened. So I guess that's just a piece that I've been feeling, Milwaukee almost feels like an anti-archival city to me sometimes, and maybe that's just me being a curmudgeon, but it does feel like a place that is in the constant process of forgetting its past, and almost proudly so. And therefore, and I'm not just saying that interpretively, but I think in practice, we do not archive that well. But
the very process of urban renewal does that.
Yes,
the very process of urban redevelopment is in some ways a structural effort to redo, forget, renew the past.
Unroot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there were a couple of points that I think were really important. The importance of encouraging students to think about the future and think about a future that they imagine. What does the future need to look like, which necessarily, Luis, gets us into this question about what has changed or not. It's tempting to, on the one hand, inflate progress, and it's also tempting to sort of shortchange progress as well. And somewhere in the middle is a sweet spot where we can then have some really good debates. Also, one last classroom idea: debates.
Yeah.
Maybe the one way to do this is to structure actual debates, force some students to be on the darker side of history, because there is something about learning and thinking through what would be, for lack of a better term, what were the oppressors up to? What went into the thought process of creating systemic mechanisms of oppression?
As
you get to think about how to undo them.
You put power in the room, kids are going to start grabbing for it. John, I have that book in my car, Milwaukee Streets, The Stories Behind Their Names. To the point I was just mentioning, one of the top first names you'll see in there is Auer. I think his first name is Louis Auer. He was a school board member long ago. But what it doesn't mention in that book, and here's what the archive leaves out, is that he was a eugenicist. And a major street in Milwaukee, Auer Avenue, is named after him. And there's a school on that's predominantly African American today that carry his name. And I was talking to some students about that, and then we were talking about what a eugenicist is. And one of the kids said to me, "I think he would really hate that this school was full of happy black kids." And I was like, "Great point." Sorry.
Of course he would. But also think about all those great funding agencies, Ford Foundation, Carnegie Foundation. I don't think that those industrialists of the late 19th, early 20th century intended for their money to be used to fight apartheid and to fight Jim Crow. Especially since they built them. They built those systems,
Yeah.
All right, Adam, we better wrap these folks up. Let's go ahead to the last slide. Folks, we thank you for your time tonight. We hope that we at least had a chance to uncover some conversations and some thoughts that might be useful. We'll continue to do these at the end of every month. As you see there, in June, we're going to talk about Latinx history in Milwaukee. And then in July, we're going to get into Milwaukee food and culture. Given our current state of affairs with COVID, we might not have all the wonderful festivals that we're used to in the city. And then in August, we're going to get into voting rights. But we will continue to have, at the end of the month, these kinds of conversations to help us think through how to do our jobs as educators and how to continually engage our young people as effectively as we possibly can. Before we wrap up, does anybody have anything they'd like to share? Any last comments? Any last chats? Any last statements?
Rob, turn your video on.
Man, it's dark out here, brother.
I want to see how dark.
You can't see me.
Oh.
Yeah.
Rob, can you tell us a ghost story?
Well, before he does that, let me tell them about the June.
Oh, yeah.
Let's
Sorry,
make sure they have
we
all the
forgot.
information.
We just went into our normal routine.
So for June, it will be starting June 10th is the first one for the digital series, which is a monthly summer series that we have been doing. But like they said, at the end of the month, we will have the table talks. So my email's there at the bottom. So if you want to join these on the weekly basis, in addition to the table talk, go ahead and shoot me an email and we can make sure that you are invited to these. They've been great. The attendance has been excellent for each week. And each week takes on its own sort of personality, but there's so much in each of the talks, a lot of resources. Everyone that comes as an attendee has great comments, a lot of book suggestions, also articles and different suggestions for resources that you could all use in a classroom. No matter what grade you're teaching, it's all adaptable. So these are really great informative sessions, not just about history, but how to understand it, how to teach it, and really engaging with each other as well too.
Rob calls them, he says this, and I love the analogy, is that they're kind of like pickup basketball a little bit, but better than the courts at Washington Park, because Rob was saying that the skill level's not that high there.
Actually, what I was saying was that if the young guys are going to go out and play basketball during a pandemic,
they better make it worth it.
You mean to tell me you came out here to play basketball and risk your health with that jump shot?
You have to heckle them at the court,
I heckle them, absolutely.
Not in this Zoom talk. You're a coward.
Dad, my job is to heckle them, absolutely. Like, you out here without a mask with that broke jumper. We also included in the chat there the Facebook page where you can see all of the previous discussions from our May series. So you can go to that Facebook page and find those as well. All right.
You should point out to them it will be their last dance. They're going to get COVID.
Heather, if you happen to have right away the curriculum website loaded up, if you could drop that in the chat, that would be
she had it.
Okay,
she did
cool.
It already.
Just like that. Yep. Cool. Well, we thank you all for joining. We will wrap up here. I'll stop the recording and we'll hang out here in the event folks want to chat a little bit more for a few minutes without the recording. So the recording has